Okay, good afternoon. We are now in week 9 and we are studying Howard Thurman and Richard Foster. And some of you may know already that Howard Thurman is one of my favorite people to talk about. He's really a fascinating and such an influential person in so many respects. Not only was he spiritual advisor to Dr. Martin Luther King, but he also wrote many books. He formed an interracial church at a time when churches were absolutely segregated, and he was a pioneer in terms of being an evangelical who spoke openly about his mystical experiences and the value and benefit of mysticism. And so we're going to talk about Howard Thurman. I know some of you have already seen parts of this PowerPoint and the lecture. You've probably heard something similar to this. So feel free, if you've already read this and heard this and you think you know what I'm going to say, I've saved the particular assignment for our class for a second lecture. So if you feel like you've already seen this lecture, you may feel free to skip it and move to the second lecture. However, for those of you who have not yet studied Howard Thurman, I think you will find this fascinating. So bear with me. I'm working with the PowerPoint that I uploaded to Dropbox entitled Howard Thurman, Spiritual Transformation and Social Justice. And the interesting thing about Howard Thurman, from my perspective, is he's a 20th century person. So I think it's easy to look at the other mystics and say, oh, they lived 500 years ago and we can't really relate to them, and maybe that's what was going on in their lives then, but our lives are different, and yet in fact Howard Thurman just died in 1981, so you can tell that he's almost a contemporary of ours, and he certainly was alive for a large part of my lifetime, and even though during the time that I was alive I had never heard of him. And so I discovered him about 5 years ago when I started teaching on the Protestant mystics for the first time, and was so fascinated to discover him. He was chaplain of Howard University. He was the first chaplain of an all-white university at BU. He was a huge influence in Martin Luther King's life. He published over 20 books, and the other thing that he did that was really, he left a treasure trove of tape recordings of meditations that he left, and videos. And so if you take the social justice, spirituality and social justice class that's coming up, you will be able to hear more about that. So his early life, he was born in Daytona Beach, Florida, which was strictly segregated at the time that he was born, and there was no high school available to African American youth in that particular town. His father died when he was 7 years old, thus his mother had to go to work, and as a result he spent a lot of time with his maternal grandmother, and she was a large influence on his life. You can see from this slide number 3 that he had to go to Jacksonville, Florida in order to attend high school, so he had to travel, and in order to attend high school, he attended college at Morehouse College with Dr. King's father, and then he graduated from Rochester Theological Seminary in 1926. His grandmother was this huge influence in his life. She said, look always up, never down, never, look always forward, backwards never, and remember that you have to work hard for what you get. So he had this very solid base in his upbringing. I'm going to go fairly quickly through this. So Halley's Comet was very influential for him because he said what he sensed was the fact that what stirred in me was one with what created and controlled the comet. So he felt this connection to God at a very early age, and felt that the creator of the universe, including the creator of Halley's Comet, also created him and was connected to him in some way. In early adulthood, he married Kate Kelly in 1926, so he was 26 years old. He was pastoring a church in Oberlin, and at the time, his wife was diagnosed with tuberculosis. He, despite her illness, he took the opportunity to study at Haverford College. I believe she went home to Florida to be cared for by her parents. But he certainly stayed in contact with her and stayed a loyal and faithful husband until she ultimately passed away. But in the meantime, he was studying with Rufus Jones. Now, Rufus Jones is fairly well known in the Christian mysticism world. He wrote some influential books, and he embraced this idea of mysticism as a means of social transformation. And that was fairly groundbreaking at that time. And so Thurman was really intrigued by that, and ultimately, I think, followed in Jones' footsteps to that degree, to that end. So he returned to Atlanta and he taught at Morehouse and Spelman colleges. His wife did pass away. He went on to become professor at Howard University and dean of Rankin Chapel there. And he developed a reputation as a creative teacher, a preacher, and a worship leader. He remarried, this time to Sue Bailey, and Sue Bailey Thurman became a very prominent person in not only in his life, but in African American circles at the time. She was a prominent employee of the YMCA in Washington, and she became a true partner for him in ministry and in all aspects of his life. She had a heart for international students. She founded the Afro-American Women's Journal, so she was publishing African American women's writing. And she also founded a museum. Now, together, they led a small African American delegation to India, Burma, and Ceylon. This was from Howard University. They took these students. And they met with Gandhi and Tagore, who's a famous Indian mystical poet, if you will. And he said that this was really truly the watershed experience of his life. He attempted to explain his Christianity despite its abuses in the United States. For instance, these Indian students were asking him how he could be a Christian and be an African American because of how badly the Christians had treated African Americans. And what he was trying to do was make a distinction between Christianity and the religion of Jesus. And he told them that he was a follower of Jesus. And so he, and to the extent that that made him a Christian, he was a Christian, but he really identified himself as a follower of Jesus. And so the significance of the trip was after the journey to India, Thurman just distinctly translated this idea of satyagraha into the Black Christian context. So satyagraha is nonviolence, it's nonviolent resistance. And it was really Gandhi's idea that helped liberate India. And Gandhi explained this idea of nonviolent resistance to Thurman, who of course then would have passed this on to Martin Luther King, and hence the beginning of the entire American civil rights movement really came from Thurman's visit to meeting Gandhi. And Gandhi said that it may be through the Negroes that the unadulterated message of nonviolence will be delivered to the world. So Gandhi saw the significance of this meeting and was very excited to have met Thurman, and this really did play out, I think, in many respects in the way that Gandhi thought that it would play out, in terms of Thurman taking this idea of nonviolent resistance to African Americans and to the United States. It's important to note that Martin Luther King did then later go on his own to visit Gandhi and learn more from him. So while they're in this part of the world, Thurman had a significant mystical experience where he was standing at the Khyber Pass, which is the pass that connects Afghanistan and Pakistan. And in that pass, he was given a vision of a church that was open to all seekers. It was non-denominational. It was interracial. It was open to people of all creeds and colors. He wanted true fellowship, he said he wanted to see if experiences of spiritual unity among peoples could be more compelling than the experiences which divide them. And so he ultimately realized this vision when he founded the Fellowship Church in San Francisco later. So he did go on to found this Fellowship Church, and he co-pastored the church. It was the nation's first interracial church congregation. It was a very unsecure financial step because he ended up leaving his very secure professor position at Howard University to go pastor this church where he didn't know if it was going to work, if anybody was going to come, if anybody was going to tithe, if he was going to get paid. But he took that leap because of having the mystical experience of the Khyber Pass. And what it gave him was it slowed his rhythm down enough that he was able to write and publish these meditations. So we're gifted with all of the books and the recordings of the meditations that he did, in part because he took the step away from academia and back to pastoring the church, which gave him a little bit more time to write and to think. Later, though, he was invited by Boston University to become the first African American dean of chapel at an all-white university. And that was such a significant position that he agreed to leave Fellowship Church. He'd started it, it was going, it was moving along, and he was able to join and be a professor at Boston University as well. There, significantly, he met Martin Luther King Jr. And he became prominent on the national stage in terms of his writing and his the meditations that he was publishing. But of course, meeting and becoming a spiritual influence for Martin Luther King Jr. was so significant. King, it said, would carry a copy of Thurman's book, I'll think of the name in a minute, with him at all times during the civil rights marches, that he always had his Bible and a copy of Thurman's book. And what Thurman said was that he didn't really speak into or give advice to Martin Luther King Jr. that much. Instead, they would hang out, they'd watch ball games, they just spent time together. But I think it was the experience of being in this wise and God-filled man's presence that Dr. King grew and came to understand what Dr. Thurman was thinking, and also probably became more interested in what he was writing and what he was publishing. So as a result, Dr. King really went to school on what Dr. Thurman was doing. So what is Thurman's legacy? He founded this Howard Thurman Educational Trust in San Francisco, which still exists. Dr. King listed him with Einstein and Churchill as one of the 10 greatest men of the 20th century. That's significant in itself. He received honorary degrees from 11 academic institutions. He spoke at 200 American and Canadian institutions, and his library includes 800 tapes of sermons and meditations. Those were the tapes that I was just mentioning. So he's also the author of this very famous quote that has been making its way around social media that says, "Don't ask yourself what the world needs. Ask yourself what makes you come alive, and then go and do that. Because what the world needs is people who have come alive." And he says that, the challenge of being African American in this country is that the burden is so heavy in either respect, as being Black or being white. It's so heavy that it's very hard for us to experience ourselves just as human beings. And so moving on to slide number 17, he really reflects the fact that, he reflects on the fact that when he was a child, he spent a lot of time alone. He spent a lot of time in the quiet, in nature, and he really came to observe that there was a sense of presence which always seemed to speak to him. And his response to the sense of presence always had this quality of personal communion. He says there was no voice, there was no image, there was no vision, there was God. And so he really, he perceived the presence of God from a very early age. He also had this experience when he was ordained, that he said during the performance of this ancient and beautiful ritual of the laying on of hands, he said the heavens opened and the Spirit descended upon him like a dove. And he said, ever since, when it seems I am deserted by the voice that called me forth, I know that I can find my way back to that moment. The clouds will lift and the path before me will once again be clear and beckoning. So whenever he found himself astray, he could go back to that experience and be grounded in God again. He said the goal of a mystic is to know God in a comprehensive sense. The vision of God is realized inclusively. So that's slide number 19. And his definition of mysticism, he says mysticism is defined as the response of the individual to a personal encounter with God within his own spirit. And the mystical experience of unity is the profoundly moving and fleeting creative encounter, that's the book that we're reading, right? With the realization that all life is one, filled with the life of the other. So all nature, all created life, it's all one, including all of humanity, all one. And then it's filled with the life of God. And so what are we to do in response to this? He says the life of the mystic is worked out in the world of men and things. Each soul must learn, so the mystic thinks, to stand up in its own right and live. So, in other words, the world is the school for the mystic to learn how to live in the world, to learn how to stand up for oneself in the world. And he goes on to say there's no clear distinction between mind and spirit, but there is a quality of mind that is more than thought. And the process of thought, this quality involves feelings and the wholeness in which the life of man has its being. So you find a very important focus on feelings in Dr. Thurman's work. He does not discount feelings. Often, I think theologians are a little wary of our feelings. They want to focus on our belief and what we know and what Scripture tells us, and they don't want to really focus on our feelings. And Thurman is someone who really includes our feelings in his thought process. And then, in a way that I think remarkably anticipates brain science, he says, in the sheer repetition of religious experience, and here he's not just talking about mystical experience. I think he's talking about just the repetition of going to church, taking communion, reading the Bible, spending time in prayer, the things that Christians do. He says certain organic changes begin to take place in the very structure of the nervous system itself. Literally, a new neurological pattern begins to emerge. And this is really, I think, based on his own life and his own life experience of spending time in the Word, spending time in prayer, spending time in church, that he noted that this change within his own neurological pattern began to emerge. He speaks more about that in the book that we're reading, The Creative Encounter. Now, it also provides us an opportunity to develop inner resources. He says, the core of my preaching has always concerned itself with the development of the inner resources needed for the creation of a friendly world of friendly men. It was important to me that individuals who were in the thick of the struggle for social change, and keep in mind he's advising not only Dr. King, but a lot of Dr. King's followers, other people involved in the civil rights marches. He says, it was important to me that individuals who were in the thick of the struggle for social change would be able to find renewal and fresh courage in the spiritual resources of the church. And it may be for that reason that he stayed behind. He did not get out in front in the marches, but he stayed behind and maintained his connection to God, maintained his spiritual practices so that he could be a resource for those who were out on the front lines doing the protests. So what's the purpose of worship? We're now on slide 26. This is the meaning of worship whenever it is found. It is an attempt to push back the boundaries of the self, to move out beyond the narrow walls that shut one in. So in other words, we need to shed this self that kind of closes us in and open, and worship allows us to open that up. Now I'm going to skip over negative energy as God. You can take a look at that. I've got 2 slides that have rather long quotes that are absolutely important, but I want you to take a look at them in slide 27 and 28. So what do we have here in a nutshell? How can we boil Howard Thurman down? We have a clear union of the head and the heart. And we've seen that over and over with the mystics, this attempt to move the head into the heart, to unite the head and the heart. Yet he does not downplay the importance of the rational. He's bringing in these feelings, he's bringing in this spiritual experience, mystical experience, if you will, but he still thinks that the rational is important. He's a great model for 20th and 21st century Christians. And he embraces our rich Christian heritage. And you never see him saying, oh, well, that's not Protestant, therefore I can't look at that, or that's, not evangelical, I'm not going to look at that. He embraces the whole of the Christian heritage. Now, the following quote on slide 30, I know this has been a long lecture, so I'm going to wrap it up, but I'm going to let you read it. Make sure you read that. How good to center down. It's such an amazing statement about prayer. So I hope you've enjoyed learning about Howard Thurman. I'm going to come back with a second lecture where I will talk through a little bit of the important takeaways that I see in chapter 1 of the book. I encourage you to read the rest of the book as well. And we will keep going. So stay tuned for lecture number 2. Take care.